There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning. No trumpet, no sign on the wall. Just an ordinary morning, a familiar corridor, and one bad decision by a man who believed he already knew everything he needed to know about the woman sitting quietly on that bench. He was wrong. He was so catastrophically, so completely wrong, that the mistake he made in those 3 minutes would follow him for the rest of his natural life. And the woman he tried to remove from a building she had every legal right to be in would one day stand at a podium, while the entire city of Richmond, Virginia watched and understood at last exactly who she had always been. But that morning, on a gray and rain-soaked Tuesday in late October, none of that had happened yet. The Hargrove County Superior Courthouse stood at the corner of Broad and Fifth, a towering structure of pale granite and marble that had been built in an era when government buildings were designed to make ordinary people feel small. The limestone columns out front were thick as tree trunks. The lobby ceiling stretched 4 stories high, its mosaic tiles depicting the scales of justice in gold and ivory, slightly faded now from decades of humidity and fluorescent light. By 8 in the morning, the corridors were already filling. Attorneys walked in pairs, heads bent over legal pads, voices low and urgent. Court reporters wheeled their equipment through the security checkpoint with practiced efficiency. Families clutched manila envelopes and whispered to each other in the echoing hallways, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people who had been waiting a long time for something they were not entirely sure would come. For Nadia Cole, the noise was simply background. She had spent the previous night beginning at 11 and ending just after 4 in the morning in the basement of the city's Municipal Financial Services building, auditing a set of servers that had been seized 9 days earlier under a court order. The servers belonged to a construction company called the Aldridge Vanthorpe Group. The company had spent the better part of 4 years building a very convincing story about itself. New contracts, community investment, ribbon-cutting ceremonies with city officials grinning beside freshly painted signage. But Nadia had been hired by the Virginia Attorney General's office 18 months ago to look past the story and find the math underneath it. And the math she had discovered told a very different story. The streets around the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse were quiet that Tuesday morning. Rain had been falling since 4 in the morning, a steady and unhurried October rain that blurred the edges of the buildings and made the granite of the courthouse facade look darker and heavier than usual. The flags above the entrance were sodden and hung still. On the steps, a handful of early arrivals stood under an overhang, checking phones, waiting for the doors to open. By 8:15, the lobby was already filling. The Aldridge Vanthorpe case had been drawing a gallery for 3 weeks. People who came not because they had a personal stake in the legal proceedings, but because the story it told of money taken from public places and public purposes by private men who believed they would never be asked to account for it, was a story that resonated. A school renovation that had been done wrong, a water treatment facility with materials that fell short of specification, a transit hub where the load-bearing elements were not what the contract said they would be. These were not abstract thefts. They were thefts from places that mattered to people who depended on them and had no particular way of knowing whether what they depended on was built correctly. Nadia Cole had spent 18 months making sure they would know. She passed through the lobby security checkpoint at 8:29. The guard at the desk, a young man she had seen on previous court days, checked her badge and waved her through. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. She found the bench. She sat down. She opened her folder. She went to work. She was 38 years old. She had been doing this work since she was 23, starting as a junior analyst at a regional audit firm in Charlotte, and climbing year by year through increasingly complex financial investigations until the AG's office called her name. She had reconstructed the finances of a state senator who moved money through 3 different shell companies and believed he had covered every trace. She had untangled a hospital billing scheme that had been running for 11 years without a single formal complaint reaching the right desk. She had once sat in a server room in Roanoke for 31 consecutive hours and emerged with a 15-page findings report that put 2 men in federal custody before Christmas. She did not get tired in the way that most people got tired. She got precise. She had grown up the daughter of 2 teachers in a mid-sized city in North Carolina. Her mother taught mathematics at the high school level for 31 years. Her father taught history for 24 years before moving into administration. They were people who believed with the quiet and consistent conviction of those who have seen the long arc of things that accuracy was a form of dignity, that knowing the truth of something and being able to demonstrate it with evidence was not just a professional skill, but a moral one. Nadia had absorbed that belief the same way she absorbed language, without having to be taught explicitly. It settled into her and became the foundation of everything she did afterward. When she was 12, she had corrected a bank statement error that had been costing her family $11 a month for 4 months. Her mother had told her she was going to be a lawyer. Her father had told her she was going to be an auditor. She had told them both she was going to figure out exactly what the numbers were saying before she decided anything. That was still at 38 the most accurate description of how she operated. She figured out what the numbers were saying, and then she told people. She had never needed anyone's permission to be in a room to do that work. She had needed a desk, a chair, a power outlet, and enough time. The Aldridge Vanthorpe case had given her 18 months and access to everything she needed. She had used every hour of it. The more hours she worked, the cleaner and more focused her thinking became. It was a quality she had noticed about herself early in her career and had learned to trust absolutely. That morning, she had driven directly from the municipal building to the courthouse without stopping home. She was wearing dark cargo pants, a worn pair of steel-toed boots that had been her standard field gear during the months she spent visiting construction sites to understand how Aldridge Vanthorpe moved its materials, and an olive field jacket. There was a faint bleach stain near the hem of the jacket from a night 2 weeks ago, when she had been reviewing documents in a storage facility that smelled of industrial cleaner and concrete dust. Her natural hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She wore no jewelry, no watch, nothing that could catch on a low beam or a server rack. She carried a heavy accordion folder stuffed with transaction logs, annotated bank records, and a color-coded grid of shell company relationships she had spent the better part of 6 months building from scratch. The Attorney General's office had issued her a gold-embossed court access badge, laminated and formal with her name, and the seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia printed clearly across its face. She had clipped it to the left side of her jacket just below the collar first thing that morning. When she arrived at the courthouse and shrugged on the jacket against the October morning chill, the lapel shifted and folded inward the way well-worn fabric does. The badge disappeared beneath the fabric. She did not notice. She had other things on her mind. The restricted third-floor corridor of the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse was the domain of judges, senior legal counsel expert, witnesses with active court appointments, and the sworn officers of the court who served them. Access required either a valid bar credential, a judicial appointment, or a court-issued access badge. The security checkpoint at the elevator bank on the first floor was meant to enforce this, and generally it did. But Nadia had entered through the back stairwell, which the bailiff on duty had propped open with a rubber wedge, while he carried boxes from the storage annex to a different floor. She had shown her badge at the main lobby desk downstairs. They had waved her through without delay. She found an empty wooden bench outside courtroom 7, near the north end of the corridor, sat down, opened her accordion folder across her knees, and began cross-referencing a set of wire transfer records against the annotated grid she had built over 6 months. The session inside courtroom 7 was scheduled to begin at 9. It was currently 8:42. She had 17 minutes. She used them the way she used all her time. She worked. She had a method for waiting that she had developed over years of working investigations that required patience. She did not check her phone. She did not look at the clock. She simply worked on whatever piece of the problem was in front of her until the next thing was ready for her attention. This morning, the piece of the problem in front of her was a wire transfer that had originated at a holding account in Norfolk, passed through 2 intermediary LLCs in Delaware and Nevada, and arrived at a third account that had no activity outside of receiving these deposits, and then within 72 hours dispersing equivalent amounts in smaller parcels to 6 separate personal accounts. She had traced this pattern across 14 transactions over a period of 8 months. Each transaction coincided within a window of 10 business days with a city contract payment to Aldridge Vanthorpe. The company received the public money. The money moved. It shed its official identity as it moved like a snake shedding a skin, and emerged at the other end transformed officially into something other than what it was. This was the work. Not the dramatic part that people imagined when they heard the words financial investigation. Not the confrontations or the courtroom or the verdict. The long, patient, methodical tracing of a path through numbers that had been designed to obscure themselves. She had been doing this for 18 months. She was very nearly done. And then the footsteps came around the corner. Dale Mercer had been on the security detail for the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse for 17 years. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, and carried himself through the marble corridors with the unhurried authority of a man who had never been told, not in any way that stuck, that he was wrong about anything that mattered. He was white, thick-necked, with a jaw he held in a permanent half-clench, as though perpetually bracing for an argument he was certain he would win. He had grown up in Chesterfield County, the son of a retired county sheriff, and he had absorbed certain understandings about the world the way a child absorbs language, without being taught explicitly, without having to think about it, without ever being forced to examine where those understandings came from or whether they were accurate. His personnel file was a document that his union representative had spent considerable energy managing over 6 years. 9 substantiated complaints in that time. 6 of them involved Black or Latino visitors to the courthouse who had reported being stopped, questioned, or physically removed from areas where they had every legal right to be. All 9 complaints had moved through the union arbitration process. In 4 cases, the union had argued procedural error on the part of the complainant, and 3 more witnesses had not come forward in sufficient numbers to sustain the finding. In 2, the complainants had ultimately declined to continue the formal process, a decision that often had less to do with confidence in the outcome and more to do with the exhaustion of fighting a system that seemed designed to outlast you. Mercer had never been formally disciplined. He had never been suspended without pay. He had twice been given a written reminder about professional conduct standards filed in his record, and according to anyone who worked beside him, those reminders changed absolutely nothing about how he moved through this building or how he spoke to the people he encountered in it. He believed in the way some people believe in gravity or seasonal weather that he knew who belonged on the 3rd floor of the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse and who did not. It was not a belief he would have articulated in those words if asked directly. He would have said experience. He would have said instinct. He would have said 17 years on this detail, and I know every attorney, every clerk, every judge's aide, every regular who walks through this corridor, and when something is off, I know it. What he meant, though he would never have said it plainly, was that the 3rd floor of this courthouse was a place for certain kinds of people, men in expensive suits with briefcases that cost more than a week's salary, women in tailored blazers with credentials and leather holders, people who moved through this building as though they owned shares in it. That was who the 3rd floor was for. and the woman sitting on the bench outside courtroom 7 at 8:43 on a Tuesday morning in work boots and a stained olive jacket with a folder of loose papers instead of a briefcase with natural hair pulled back, instead of something more carefully arranged for an environment like this, was not in his instantaneous and entirely unexamined assessment one of them. He rounded the corner at the north end of the corridor and stopped, looked at her. She did not look up. She was writing something in the margin of a document, her pen moving quickly, her focus absolute and complete. He stood there for a moment. 2 seconds. 3. Then he started walking toward her. His heels clicked on the marble with that slow, deliberate rhythm that was not quite a march, but was not quite a walk either. It was the pace of a man who believed the space he was crossing belonged to him. Nadia heard the footsteps before she saw him. She did not look up immediately. She was in the middle of the calculation tracing a wire transfer that had moved from a holding account in Norfolk to a Shell LLC registered in Delaware, and she wanted to finish the note before she lost the thread. She finished it. She capped her pen. She looked up. "Hey!" Mercer's voice was sharp enough to carry down the corridor without shouting. It was not a greeting. It was a summons. The kind of word that is meant to establish, before anything else has been said, who is in charge of what is about to happen. Nadia looked at him. His hand was hooked into his utility belt. His jaw was doing that thing she recognized immediately, that set look of a man who had already arrived at his conclusion before he had asked a single question. She recognized the posture the way you recognize a kind of weather you have seen before. Familiar and unwelcome. She said calmly and clearly, "Can I help you, officer?" "The question is," Mercer said, coming to a stop a few feet from her bench, his eyes already moving across her jacket, her boots, her folder, the bench itself, as though she were a problem that needed categorizing how you got up here. "This floor is restricted. It is for court personnel, attorneys, and authorized parties only. The public waiting area is on the first floor next to the cafeteria." She looked at him steadily. "I am aware of the building layout. I am an authorized party. I am waiting for the session in courtroom 7 to begin. My name is Nadia Cole. I am the prosecution's lead forensic accountant in the State versus Aldridge Vanthorpe Construction Group." Mercer's expression did not change in the way a person's face changes when new information arrives and is processed. It changed in the way a face changes when an inconvenient statement has been received and set aside. "Right," he said. The word was not a word. It was a door closing. "Look, lady," he said, "I have been working this floor for 17 years, and I know every attorney and every credentialed expert who walks through that elevator. I don't know you. You need to pack up your drawing project and take the elevator to the first floor and wait in the lobby like everybody else before I decide to write you up for trespassing." She held his gaze. She did not shift or look away. She did not check herself against his assessment of her. "If you check the court manifest for today," she said, "my name is on it. It has been on it for 3 weeks. I was issued a court access badge by the Attorney General's office." She reached toward the left lapel of her jacket. Mercer took a half step forward. His hand moved to the handcuffs at his waist. Not reaching for them, not touching them, just letting her know they were there. His voice dropped. "I don't need to check a manifest. I know who is authorized to be on this floor, and I don't know you. Now get up." Nadia took a breath, slow and even. She had dealt with this before. Not here, not in this corridor, but she had been in buildings where her presence was treated as an error to be corrected, and she had learned through experience that was both painful and instructive that calm was not weakness in these moments. Calm was a form of documentation. Every word she said at a controlled volume, every request she made with specificity, every refusal she offered without flinching was being recorded in the memory of the moment. In the hallway, in the eyes of the paralegal who had slowed her walk 20 feet away, in the consciousness of the administrative clerk who had cracked open an office door at the sound of raised voices. She said, "I am not going to get up. I have a court-issued access badge. My name is on the day's manifest. I have lawful authorization to be on this floor, and I am asking you to verify that before you make a decision you cannot take back." The air in the corridor thickened. A second door opened further down. Two faces peered out. Mercer felt the defiance land in his chest like something hot. He had stood in this corridor for 17 years. He had removed people who did not belong here. He had been thanked for it. He had been told he was good at his job. He had 9 complaints and 0 formal discipline, and a union that had consistently stood between him and any consequence that might have clarified earlier and more forcefully what kind of man he was. He leaned in close. His voice went low and deliberate, the kind of quiet that is meant to feel like a hand around a wrist. He said, "You are going to close that folder. You are going to stand up, and you're going to walk to the elevator. If you do not, I will remove you from this floor in handcuffs, and I promise you you will spend the rest of this morning in a holding cell in the basement level of this building." Nadia closed her accordion folder carefully. Her hands were steady. She latched the clasps. Then she leaned back slightly against the bench. She did not stand. She looked up at him, and what he saw in her face was not the fear he was accustomed to producing with that voice and that posture and that specific kind of quiet. It was not the flustered apology, the sudden deference, the quick reaching for a phone to call someone who could vouch for her presence. What he saw was something composed and cold and absolutely certain. She said, "Officer, I am going to tell you something clearly, and I am going to tell you only once. You are making a very serious mistake. If you remove me from this floor, you will be obstructing an active felony trial in which I am the prosecution's primary expert witness. I am telling you this now clearly and in plain language because in approximately 60 seconds the option to walk away from this will no longer be available to you. Check the manifest. That is all I am asking you to do. Walk to the clerk's desk and check the manifest." Mercer looked at her. He looked at the jacket, the boots, the folder, the bench. The sheer audacity of the instruction delivered from a seated position by a woman he had already categorized and dismissed short-circuited something in him. He was not used to being told to walk away. He was not used to a woman looking up at him from a courthouse bench as though she were the one with authority in this hallway. He felt his temper break in the way that dry things break. No bending, no warning, just the clean snap of something giving way. He reached down and grabbed her left arm above the elbow. His fingers were thick and his grip was not gentle. The pain was immediate and sharp, radiating from her elbow into her shoulder joint. Nadia's body went rigid. She said clearly and loudly enough for the paralegal who had stopped moving, and for the 2 administrative staffers who were now fully in their doorways, "Take your hands off me. I do not consent to this. I am not resisting. You have no lawful basis for this contact." Mercer tightened his grip and hauled her to her feet. Her accordion folder slid off her lap and hit the marble floor with a crack that rang down the corridor. Transaction logs scattered across the tile, fanning out in a pale arc around the bench. "Resisting an officer," Mercer announced. He said it to the corridor, to the witnesses and doorways, to some imaginary audience of approving colleagues. "You are done, lady." He twisted her arm behind her back and pushed her forward. Nadia planted her feet. She was smaller than him by a significant measure. She outweighed him in precision and purpose, but not in mass. He pushed harder. Her steel-toed boots slipped slightly on the polished marble. "This is assault," she said, her voice still controlled but carrying now a fine edge of something urgent and precisely placed. "You have not checked the manifest. You have not verified my identity through any lawful means. You are physically restraining a state employee without lawful basis, and there are witnesses in this corridor." "I don't need to check anything," Mercer said. His breath was close and carried the stale sourness of gas station coffee and a long morning. I run security on this floor. I say who stays and who goes. He pushed her forward. He could have walked her to the elevator. That was the rational decision. That was the choice a man with any genuine awareness of his own professional exposure would have made. Walk her to the elevator. Send her to the lobby file the incident report let the front desk sort out who she was. Safe. Contained. Undramatic. But Mercer was not in that moment operating from awareness. He was operating from wounded pride and 17 years of a certain kind of unchecked authority. He had been defied on his floor. He had been told to walk away by a woman with a folder of papers and a field jacket. He had been looked at without fear, and he wanted with a force that overrode every other consideration to be seen prevailing. He wanted the attorneys and the clerks and the bailiffs to look out their doors and see Dale Mercer doing his job, doing it correctly, taking out the garbage. Courtroom 7 was 30 feet away. He could see the lights on through the long, narrow panel of reinforced glass beside the door. The session had been scheduled to begin at 9, and it was now 9:02, and he was going to walk this woman down that aisle and show this whole floor who ran things up here. He pushed Nadia toward the heavy oak doors. She said one last time with a weight in her voice that was not anger, but was something more absolute than anger, something more certain. If you open those doors, you will not be able to close them again. This is your last opportunity. Mercer reached out with his free hand and pushed the brass handles. The doors swung open. The sound that entered the courtroom with them was the sound of marble corridor and morning air, and Mercer's deliberate footsteps, and the reluctant scrape of Nadia's steel-toed boots on a surface she was not being given the choice to walk across willingly. Then the doors closed behind them, and the entire room went absolutely, completely, and devastatingly silent. Courtroom 7 of the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse was a grand space designed to communicate the weight of what happened inside it. Dark mahogany paneling lined 3 walls. Frosted glass windows filtered the morning light into something dim and serious, and suffused with consequence. 6 full rows of gallery seating, and every seat was occupied. Journalists from the Richmond Dispatch, the Virginia Tribune, and 2 wire services occupied the back 2 rows with notepads open and pens already moving, because the Aldridge Vanthorpe case was the most significant civic corruption trial this county had seen in a decade, and they had been here every day for 3 weeks, and they were going to continue being here every day until the verdict. City council members were in the row behind the prosecution table. Representatives from 3 separate advocacy groups sat near the aisle. 12 members of a jury occupied the high-backed chairs to the left, and all 12 of them turned now toward the back of the room at the sudden intrusion of sound. The gallery of Courtroom 7 held the kind of audience that the Aldridge Vanthorpe case had been drawing for 3 weeks. Not just the legal press, not just the City Hall correspondents who covered municipal finance as a beat, but the investigative reporters who had been following the paper trail since the original whistleblower complaint 9 months ago. The ones who had filed public records requests and waited and filed again, and waited some more and finally gotten back documents that confirmed what they had suspected, that the public money set aside for the renovation of 2 elementary schools on the south side had been quietly redirected through a series of accounting maneuvers elegant enough to require a specialist to decode into the private accounts of people who had never laid a brick or poured a footing or inspected a load-bearing beam in their lives. They were here because the story was real, because $14 million of public money had been stolen from infrastructure that real families used. From schools where children sat in chairs and learned things and trusted that the ceiling above them was what it was supposed to be. From a water treatment facility that served 3 neighborhoods on the river. From a transit hub where people with early shift jobs stood in the cold at 6 in the morning and waited for a bus. Real people, real money, and they were in this courtroom to watch someone explain line by line how it had happened. No one in that gallery had expected the morning to begin with a security officer dragging the prosecution's lead witness down the center aisle in handcuffs. But when it did not, a single pen in the room went still. At the front of the room, elevated behind a massive bench of carved oak, sat the Honorable Constance Okafor. Judge Okafor was 61 years old. She had served on the bench of the Hargrove County Superior Court for 19 years. Before that, she had spent 12 years as an assistant district attorney in this same city, trying cases in these same courtrooms, learning the architecture of the law from the inside. Before that, 2 years clerking for a federal circuit court judge, who had told her on her last day that she had the sharpest legal mind he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. He had said it without sentiment in the way that precise people state precise things. She was known in the Virginia judicial community for a particular quality, not severity, not volume, precision. She said very little, and what she said arrived with the weight of something that had been measured carefully before it left her mouth. When you appeared before Judge Okafor and you were wrong, you knew it immediately, because she told you without theater, without dramatics, without any of the performance that lesser jurists use to substitute for clarity. And the absence of theater made it worse, because it left you alone with the fact that you were wrong, and no one was going to make a show of it, which meant there was no spectacle to hide behind. What made Judge Okafor formidable was not her reputation. Reputation is what other people say about you, and it can be managed, inflated, distorted. What made her formidable was the quality of her attention. She watched. In 19 years on the bench, she had developed the capacity to observe a courtroom the way a seasoned pilot observes weather. Not just what was visible at the moment, but what the visible things predicted. She watched the way attorneys moved when they were confident, and the way they moved when they were managing doubt. She watched juries in their box, the small shifts in posture that indicated something had landed or had failed to land. She watched witnesses and read the gap between what they said and how they held themselves when they said it. And she watched the proceedings with the awareness of a person who understood that what happened inside this room had consequences outside it. Real consequences. For real people. For the families in the gallery. For the city whose money had been stolen. For the structures that real people used and relied on and trusted without knowing whether they should. She had not missed the sound of the oak doors opening at 9:02. She had not missed the quality of the silence that followed. And she had not for a single second missed the expression on Dale Mercer's face as he marched down that center aisle. The expression of a man who was certain he was right. She had seen that expression many times in 19 years. It was never a good sign. She had been addressing the defense counsel regarding a procedural matter when the oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. She finished her sentence. She set down her pen. She looked toward the back of the room with the calm, unhurried gaze of someone who had seen many things in this courtroom over 19 years and was prepared at all times to see one more. What she saw was a security officer she recognized as Dale Mercer, a man who had worked the third-floor security detail of this courthouse for years, and whom she had never had occasion to formally address, gripping the arm of a black woman in a field jacket and steel-toed work boots and marching her down the center aisle of her courtroom. The woman's arm was twisted behind her back. Her face was tight with controlled pain. Her jaw was set. Her eyes, despite everything, were steady. Mercer's voice came up the aisle ahead of him. He was projecting. He wanted the room to hear. He wanted to be understood as executing a necessary function. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor. I found this individual loitering in the restricted wing of the third floor. She was uncooperative, refused to identify herself, and resisted my lawful commands. I am removing her from the premises and taking her to the holding area on the basement level." He expected nods. He expected the bailiff to move toward him and assist. He expected the judge to offer a brief acknowledgement and wave them out so the session could resume. The reaction he received was none of those things. At the prosecution table, a man named Marcus Webb, Senior Assistant Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Virginia, stood up so fast that his chair slid backward on its rollers and struck the low wooden rail with a sound that cut through the hushed gallery. He was 51 years old, lean, with a full beard going gray at the edges, and in 19 years of trying cases in courts across this state, he had never not once abandoned courtroom decorum the way he abandoned it in that moment. Marcus Webb had been in this business long enough to have faced a great many things without losing composure. He had tried a case while a hurricane was battering the coast 2 hours south, and the windows of the courthouse were rattling in their frames. He had cross-examined a witness who had lied to him directly for 45 minutes before he had sufficient evidence to demonstrate the lie, and he had maintained his tone throughout. He had sat across a conference table from men who had defrauded the state of significant amounts of public money, and he had been professional. He had been precise. He had kept his voice level and his questions focused, because that was what the work required. But when he looked up from the prosecution table at 9:02 and saw Dale Mercer marching down the center aisle of courtroom 7 with Nadia Cole's arm pinned behind her back, something in Marcus Webb gave way. Not his professionalism. He recovered that within seconds. But the initial reaction, the standing too fast, the chair sliding back, the voice that came out louder and with less control than he had intended, that was not professional. That was human. That was a man who had worked with Nadia Cole for 18 months, who had watched her spend weekends in server rooms and nights in basements, and early mornings going over numbers that other people would have handed off to a junior analyst. That was a man who knew what this case had cost her, and what her presence in this courtroom that morning meant, looking at her being dragged toward him by someone who had no idea who she was. He recovered. He always recovered. But the initial reaction was real, and every journalist in the gallery had seen it, and they wrote it down. He came around the prosecution table at something close to a run. What in God's name he said, and the sentence had no ending because his voice gave out somewhere in the middle of it. Nadia. He said her name again louder. Nadia. From the bench a sound. Not loud, not performative. 3 sharp strikes of the gavel, each one clean and precise, like the sound of something breaking that was meant to break. The room went still. Judge Okafor's voice when it came was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of quiet that is louder than shouting, because it fills all available space and leaves no room for anything else. Officer Mercer. She said the name without inflection. Release that woman's arm. Mercer stopped walking. He was halfway down the center aisle. He looked at the judge. He looked at the prosecutor who had come around the table and was now closing the distance between them. He looked at the 60-something faces in the gallery. All of them turned toward him and felt the first real trickle of something cold and specific moving through his chest. Your Honor. He said she was found in the restricted wing without visible authorization. She was exhibiting non-compliant behavior. She refused to provide identification when requested, and she resisted my commands. Refused to provide identification, the judge repeated. The phrase was not a question. It was a stone placed on a scale. Heavy. And if you do not remove your hand from that woman's person in the next 2 seconds, she continued, her eyes absolutely level, her voice absolutely still, I will direct my bailiff to place handcuffs on your wrists in this courtroom in front of every journalist seated in this gallery. 1. The second did not need to come. Mercer dropped Nadia's arm as though it had become something he did not want to be holding. He stepped back. His hands went up, palms outward, the instinctive gesture of a man who has just arrived somewhere he does not fully understand. Nadia stepped away from him. She moved her left shoulder in a slow rotation, testing the joint. Her face registered the pain and then composed itself with a speed that was itself a form of information. She looked at the judge. "My apologies for the disruption, Your Honor." She said it without a tremor. "I was waiting in the corridor as directed by the bailiff's office." Marcus Webb reached her side and put a careful hand on her arm, the right arm gently. "Are you hurt?" he said, low and urgent. She shook her head once. "I am fine." Webb looked at Mercer. The expression on his face was not one that Mercer had ever had directed at him from the position Webb occupied in this room. "You ignorant man," Webb said. He said it the way you state a fact, without heat, without performance, without any of the accompaniments that usually come with anger, just the fact placed in the air where everyone in the room could hear it. "This is Nadia Cole. She is the lead forensic accountant for the prosecution in the State versus Aldrich Vanthorpe Construction Group. She is our primary expert witness. Her testimony today represents 18 months of investigative work. Without her presence, without her testimony, this case does not move forward." A murmur moved through the gallery, not loud, but present, undeniable. The journalists in the back 2 rows were writing. All of them. The 2 city council members in the gallery exchanged a look that required no words. One of them set down her pen and pressed her fingers together. Mercer turned to look at Nadia, at the jacket, at the olive field coat with the bleach stain near the hem, at the steel-toed boots, at the accordion folder that was now sitting back on the bench in the corridor, its contents scattered across the marble floor, because his grip on her arm had knocked it from her lap. He tried to say something. His mouth opened. She didn't, he managed. She didn't have her identification visible. "Your Honor." Nadia pulled back the left lapel of her jacket. There, clipped to her belt exactly where she had placed it that morning, was a gold-embossed badge bearing the seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia and her full name in clear black print. The lapel had shifted when she put on the jacket in the morning chill. That was all that had happened. She looked at the judge. She spoke directly to the bench. "Officer Mercer asked me to present my identification. When I reached toward my jacket to retrieve this badge, which was clipped to my belt beneath the lapel, he stated that if I reached toward my coat, he would assume I was reaching for a weapon. He then forcibly restrained my left arm and brought me into this courtroom. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that arrives after something irreversible has occurred, and the room has not yet decided how to move forward." Judge Okafor removed her glasses. She set them on the bench in front of her. She looked at Dale Mercer. She looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she said bailiff. Henry Graves, the courtroom bailiff who had worked Courtroom 7 for 11 years, and who had in that time seen most of what a courthouse corridor and gallery could produce, stepped forward. "Please escort Officer Mercer to the front of this bench and remain with him." Mercer walked. His boots, which had been so deliberate and authoritative on the marble outside, felt uncertain now, as though the floor beneath them had subtly shifted, and he was not entirely confident of his footing. He stopped before the elevated bench and looked up. Judge Okafor looked down at him. She said, "Tell me in plain language the lawful basis you had for physically restraining that woman in the corridor." He said, "She was present in a restricted area. She appeared to be without authorization. She refused to comply with my order to vacate. Did you ask her name?" He said, "I did not ask immediately." "Did you ask her to present credentials before initiating physical contact?" He said, "I asked her to show her ID." "Did she indicate that she had identification?" A pause. "She said she had a badge." "And did you look at the badge?" "She said it was under her coat." "Did you check the day's court manifest before initiating physical contact?" "Number." Did your supervisory chain instruct you to remove individuals from the third-floor corridor without credential verification? Number. Then, what precisely led you to decide before taking any of these verification steps that this woman did not belong on that floor? The question sat in the air. It sat there for a very long time. Mercer opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the judge. He looked at the gallery. He looked at Nadia, who was watching him with the calm, assessing expression of someone who was filing away everything she observed, the way she filed away every number, every transaction, every discrepancy that told her what a financial record was actually saying beneath the surface of what it claimed. She looked, he finally said, like she didn't belong. The phrase fell into the room. Not with drama, not with theater. With the flat, irreversible weight of a fact being recorded. Every journalist wrote it down. Every pen in the back 2 rows. The 2 city council members looked at each other again, and this time neither of them looked away for a long while. She looked like she didn't belong. Judge Okafor put her glasses back on. She made 3 careful notations on the legal pad to her left. She turned to Marcus Webb. "Mr. Webb," she said, "as an officer of this court, did you witness an unprovoked physical assault on a state employee in the corridor of this courthouse today?" Webb straightened his jacket. He said, "I did, Your Honor," as did, I believe, approximately 62 other witnesses. The judge turned back to face the bench. She did not look at Mercer again. "Bailiff, please relieve Officer Mercer of his access credentials, his radio, and his security identification, and escort him from this courtroom. Direct him to the security supervisory office on the 1st floor, and inform them that the court has ordered his immediate suspension pending a full administrative review. If he re-enters this building today without legal representation, he is to be detained." Henry Graves put a hand on Mercer's shoulder. Not rough, firm and final. Mercer looked at the hand. He looked at the judge, who had already returned her attention to the documents on her bench. He looked at Nadia one more time. She was not gloating. She was not smiling. She was not performing victory for the gallery. She was simply watching him with the same steady, thorough attention she brought to everything, the same quality that had allowed her to sit in a server room in a municipal basement for 5 hours and find the single wire transfer that unraveled 6 months of financial concealment. She was recording. Mercer turned. He walked back up the center aisle of courtroom 7, the same aisle he had marched down with Nadia's arm pinned behind her back, the same aisle he had chosen specifically because he wanted to be seen, because he had wanted the attorneys and the journalists and the court staff to see Dale Mercer handling his business. Every seat in the gallery was still turned toward him. Every pen had stopped. At the courtroom doors, the bailiff took his keycard and his radio and his building identification badge and placed them in a tray that was then sealed with a dated and initialed label. The heavy oak doors closed behind him. In the corridor outside, standing beside the bench where Nadia's accordion folder still sat, with transaction logs scattered across the marble floor, in a pale arc, Mercer stood alone. 2 administrative staffers were already on their phones. One of them, a woman named Kerrigan, had filmed approximately 90 seconds of the corridor confrontation on her personal device before Mercer had reached the courtroom doors. She had filmed from inside her doorway, her hand slightly shaking. The footage was already uploading. By the evening of the day of the incident, the corridor footage had been viewed by nearly 400,000 people. The clip was 16 seconds long. It showed Mercer's hand on Nadia's arm. It showed the angle of her shoulder. It showed the accordion folder hitting the marble floor. It showed her saying something that the audio muffled and caught at a distance, did not quite reproduce clearly enough to transcribe, but whose tone required no transcription. And it showed Mercer's face, not angry, not frightened, satisfied. The face of a man who believed he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. That was the thing that people who shared the clip wrote about. not the physical confrontation, the expression, the absolute, uncomplicated certainty. The comments sections filled overnight. Local residents who had experienced similar confrontations in public buildings across the city wrote about them. Women who had been turned away from office building lobbies. Men who had been followed through department stores. People who had been asked to produce identification in situations where their white counterparts had been waved through without a second look. The clip became in the way that certain short pieces of video become a focal point for something much larger than the 16 seconds it contained. And in the morning, the journalist who had been in courtroom 7 filed stories that made the focal point even sharper, because they had the transcript. She looked like she didn't belong. Those words, in print, in every story, above the fold, inside courtroom 7. Judge Okafor took a slow sip of water from the glass on the bench. She set it down. She looked at the prosecution table. "Mr. Webb," she said, "if your witness is ready, I suggest we proceed without further delay. I will not allow the conduct of a single courthouse security officer to derail a case that this court and this city have been waiting on for a very long time." Webb turned. "The state calls Nadia Cole," he said. Nadia picked up a copy of her prepared summary from the prosecution table. She walked to the witness stand. She raised her right hand. She was sworn in. She settled into the chair. Her accordion folder was in her lap. Her boots were flat on the floor. Her posture was straight. The gallery watched her. The same boots, the same jacket. The same woman who had been dragged down this aisle 45 minutes ago, now occupying the witness stand with the unhurried authority of someone who had always known she would end up here and had never for a single moment doubted her right to take this seat. She looked at Marcus Webb. She was ready. She had always been ready. For the next 4.5 hours, Nadia Cole dismantled the Aldridge Vanthorpe Construction Group with the quiet, methodical authority of someone who had been building toward this moment for 18 months. She explained how the company had won 3 public construction contracts from the city of Richmond worth a combined $41 million, a partial renovation of 2 elementary schools on the south side, a water treatment facility expansion along the river corridor, a new transit hub on the East End where 4 bus lines converged and several thousand commuters passed through every single day. On all 3 projects, she said Aldridge Vanthorpe had substituted lower-grade materials than the contracts specified. They had billed the city for the higher-grade materials they never used. The difference, which she had traced through 4 layers of shell companies' intermediary accounts and falsified invoices over 18 months of work, amounted to $14.3 million. She showed the jury the transaction chains on the courtroom display. She explained each shell company line by line. She presented the color-coded grid she had built from scratch, designed specifically so that 12 people who were not forensic accountants could follow the money from where it left the city to where it disappeared into the private accounts of the men who had stolen it. The defense counsel, Lawrence Gould, a man who wore shoes that cost more than some people's weekly salary and had successfully defended 2 previous construction fraud cases by creating doubt around methodology attempted on cross-examination to undermine her. He questioned whether her transaction reconstruction involved assumptions. He suggested that several of the connections she had drawn were interpretive rather than evidential. He implied, without quite stating it directly, that the dramatic circumstances of the morning, the disruption in the corridor, the physical confrontation, the forcible entry into the courtroom might have influenced the jury's perception of this witness in ways that were not purely based on the evidence. Nadia listened to each question. She answered each one. "The transactions are in evidence," she said. "The shell company registrations are in evidence. The wire transfer records, the bank statements, and the audited accounts are all in evidence. Nothing I have presented today is my opinion. It is arithmetic, and arithmetic does not adjust based on how long someone has been in practice or how much their shoes cost. The jury watched her. Lawrence Gould was good at his job. That was not in dispute. He had defended 2 previous construction fraud cases, and in both instances had managed to introduce sufficient doubt about the prosecution's financial methodology to avoid conviction on the primary charges. He was skilled at finding the seams in an argument, the places where an expert's confidence in their own methodology might reveal an assumption that had been passed off as a conclusion, the places where the chain of evidence, however strong, contained a link that could be held up to the light and questioned. He began by asking Nadia about her use of transaction clustering, a methodology that groups related transactions based on timing and amount proximity, and treats the group as a single movement of funds. He asked whether transaction clustering was a universally accepted methodology in forensic accounting. She said it was widely used and peer-reviewed, and that she had applied it in accordance with established professional standards. He asked whether the selection of the clustering window, the 5-day window she had applied to group transactions as related, was her own professional judgment or an industry standard. She said it was a professional judgment made based on the operational characteristics of the specific shell company structure, which she then explained in detail that required Gould to listen carefully and say nothing for 45 seconds. He asked whether the conclusions she had drawn about the movement of funds from Aldridge Vanthorpe through the shell company network to personal accounts were conclusions or interpretations. She said that the wire transfer records documented the movement of specific dollar amounts on specific dates between specific accounts. She said that the shell company registrations documented who owned those accounts. She said that the personal account statements documented who received the money at the end of the chain. She said that the connection between those 3 sets of documents was not interpretation. It was a record of what had occurred. She said, in the same measured and unhurried voice she had been using all morning, that she had been doing this work for 15 years, and that arithmetic had never once changed its conclusions based on who was asking questions about it. Gould had no further questions. Gould sat down. He had no rebuttal. 3 floors below, in a security holding room on the basement level, Dale Mercer was having a very different morning. He was sitting on a steel bench bolted to the wall. His keycard and radio were in a labeled tray in the supervisory office down the hall. His hands were in his lap. He had been told to wait. He had been waiting for 53 minutes when the door finally opened. It was not his direct supervisor who came in. It was Carl Stroud, the union representative who had handled 6 of Mercer's 9 complaints and who had sat across from him in 3 separate arbitration hearings and navigated each one to a resolution that left Mercer's record clean and his paycheck uninterrupted. Carl was 56, balding with the weariness of a man who has spent 2 decades managing other people's problems and has run out of the particular energy that managing this kind often requires. He was holding a manila folder. He did not sit down. Mercer stood up when he came in. He had already rehearsed the beginning of this. Carl, he said what happened up there was a good faith error. The woman had no visible credentials. She was in a restricted area without escort. She refused to comply with a lawful order to vacate. It was a misidentification, and the union needs to get ahead of this before the press has been given the wrong version all day. Carl set the folder on the steel bench. "Sit down, Tom," he said. "I don't want to sit down," Mercer said. "I want my badge and my radio back, and I want union representation on this before anyone files anything." Carl looked at him. "Your badge is currently in an evidence locker at the Attorney General's office. They filed a preliminary criminal complaint before 11 this morning." Mercer stared at him. "Criminal complaint," he said. "Third-degree assault," Carl said. "False imprisonment. Official oppression. 3 separate charges. And the union is not extending representation for this incident." Mercer felt the floor shift beneath him. What do you mean not extending representation? The bylaws protect officers acting within the scope of their lawful authority, Tom. You violated that scope in approximately 6 ways in the span of 5 minutes. He opened the folder. You bypassed credential verification. You initiated physical contact without establishing a lawful basis for detention. You ignored a direct and repeated statement of identity and court authorization from the person you were detaining. You failed to contact your supervisory chain before escalating. You brought the individual into a live courtroom session, in handcuffs, in front of a sitting judge and the senior assistant attorney general and 62 members of the press. Mercer said it was a mistake. I did not know who she was. Carl looked at him with the look of a man who has said what he needed to say and has nothing more to offer. Footage from the corridor has already been broadcast on 2 local stations, he said. Channel 4 ran it at 11:15. The AG's office issued a statement at noon. The courthouse director has convened an emergency review, and the law firm that represents the forensic consulting group this woman works through filed a civil notice of claim against the county at 2 o'clock. It was a mistake, Mercer said again. Carl picked up the folder. You told a sitting federal judge in open court with the press present that you removed that woman from a floor she was legally authorized to occupy because, and I am quoting the transcript that was just emailed to this office, she looked like she didn't belong. Mercer said nothing. That is what you said, in front of everyone. Carl Stroud had been a union representative for 22 years. He had handled cases involving excessive force complaints on duty accidents, harassment allegations, and procedural violations. He had sat in arbitration hearings where the evidence against the officer in question was substantial, and the outcome had gone in the officer's favor anyway, because the arbitration process was designed with a particular set of protections that could, when applied carefully and consistently, produce that outcome. He was not himself a corrupt man. He was a pragmatic one. He believed that the system he worked within had a function, and that the function was to protect people who wore a uniform from being destroyed by accusations that were sometimes unfounded. He had seen unfounded accusations. He had also seen accusations that were entirely founded, and that the system had, through his work and the work of people like him, been prevented from producing their natural consequences. He was not at peace with all of those cases, but he had made his peace with the distinction between what he believed and what the job required. He had never, in 22 years, walked into a holding room and told an officer that the union was withdrawing representation. He had done it today. He had done it because the footage from the corridor was not ambiguous, and because the AG's complaint was not ambiguous, and because 62 documented witnesses were not ambiguous, and because sometimes the cases that the system was designed to manage were not the cases that happened. Sometimes the case that happened was this one. He had walked out of that holding room, and he had not looked back. And driving home that evening, past the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse with its sodden flags and its pale granite, he had tried to figure out whether he felt relieved or something else. He was still working on that. Get a private attorney, Tom. Call home. Do not contact anyone from the 3rd floor. Any witness, any staff member affiliated with the Aldridge Vanthorpe case, or anyone from the AG's office under any circumstances. Carl paused at the door. He looked back. For what it is worth, he said, and his voice was not unkind, only final. She had a gold badge clipped to her jacket. You never looked. He walked out. The door closed. Mercer sat in the steel-benched holding room in the basement of the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse. The irony of his location had not escaped him. This was the room he had told Nadia Cole she would spend the morning in. He had said it as a threat. He had said it with complete certainty. And now he was the one sitting in it without his badge, without his radio, without the union that had carried him through 9 complaints in 6 years, and for the first time in 17 years, without a floor to walk. The week that followed moved with a specific and terrible momentum. The Richmond Dispatch ran a 14-paragraph story on Wednesday morning. The story included a screenshot from Kerrigan's corridor footage, time-stamped, showing Mercer's hand on Nadia's arm. It included the exact phrase from Judge Okafor's in-court exchange. She looked like she didn't belong. Those words, on every news feed in the city, on the front page of the print edition below the fold but visible from the rack, shared across every platform by the following morning. 2 advocacy groups issued statements by Thursday. A third filed a formal request for an independent review of Mercer's full personnel history on Friday afternoon. By Friday evening, the Aldridge Vanthorpe trial had moved into its final discovery phase. The pressure of Nadia's testimony and the evidentiary record she had spent 18 months constructing had begun to produce its effects at the company's executive level. 6 mid-level managers and directors facing the mathematical clarity of a financial case that left them no ambiguity about their exposure instructed their attorneys to open plea negotiations. The company's chief financial officer, a man named Mitchell Crane, who had personally approved the wire transfers that moved $14 million from public contracts into private accounts, through 4 layers of shell companies, agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation. He submitted a hard drive. The drive contained 17 months of encrypted internal financial records. On a Tuesday evening, Nadia was in the Attorney General's Financial Crimes Conference Room. She was there with Marcus Webb, 2 forensic technology specialists, and Crane's attorney, who had submitted the decryption key as part of the cooperation agreement. The drive contained a subaccount labeled Site Facilitation, biweekly cash payments, recipients identified only by internal employee codes. Nadia spotted the pattern in the payment dates in approximately 8 minutes. She leaned forward over the conference table. She looked at the payment calendar. She looked at the city building inspection records she had been carrying in her head for 18 months. She said quietly to Webb these align. He looked where she was pointing. Every major payment in this subaccount lands within 4 business days of a city building inspection that was formally passed without the required structural sign-off documentation on file. Webb straightened. He looked at the drive specialist. "Run the decryption against the recipient codes," he said. The specialist typed for 90 seconds. The screen flickered. The alphanumeric codes resolved into names. Most were contractors. 2 were overnight dispatchers at municipal yards. 1 was a building inspector whose name appeared in a dismissed complaint from 18 months ago that no one had followed up on. And then 4 entries from the bottom of the list. Nadia went very still. CM04, Dale Mercer, Hargrove County Superior Courthouse Security Division, $3,200 per month, 26 months, $83,200 total, paid through a home improvement company registered in Henrico County under a name that was on further investigation that of Mercer's brother-in-law. Webb read it twice. He sat back in his chair. He put his hand over his mouth and held it there. He stared at the screen. Then he looked at Nadia. When he saw her in the corridor that morning, he said slowly, "Do you believe he knew who you were?" Nadia thought about the corridor, the approach, the way his eyes had moved across her, assessing and dismissing in a single motion, the contempt that had been present before he asked a single question, the absolute certainty with which he had reached for her arm. "No," she said. "He did not know who I was. If he had recognized me as the lead forensic accountant actively reconstructing the financial chain that leads directly to him, he would have walked past me without a word. He would have had every reason to be afraid of me. But he did not see me. He saw a black woman in work clothes sitting on a bench, and he decided in under 3 seconds that she did not belong on a floor where he had been operating unchecked for 17 years. and that decision led him to grab my arm. Webb nodded. And grabbing your arm, he said, led him to march you into the one room in this building where the people with the authority and the evidence to prosecute him were assembled in real time, waiting. Nadia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The math always comes out." Webb picked up the phone and called the FBI. The following Monday, Mercer was in the leather-chaired office of his private defense attorney, a methodical man named Philip Cotter, discussing a defense strategy that centered on good faith misidentification and the ambiguity of visual assessment in high-pressure security environments. The glass door to the law firm suite opened. Marcus Webb walked in. 2 FBI agents in dark windbreakers followed him. Webb was holding a document. He looked across the waiting area at Mercer. He said his name. Cotter stood. He said that Webb could not approach a represented individual without an appointment or a warrant. Webb held up the federal arrest warrant signed that morning. He informed Mercer that he was under arrest for federal bribery, obstruction of justice, and violation of racketeering statutes in connection with payments received from the Aldridge Vanthorpe Construction Group over a period of 26 months. Mercer's face went the color of old chalk. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. The agent to Webb's left moved around the desk and took Mercer's arm. He let himself be stood up. He let his arms be positioned behind his back. He felt the metal of the handcuffs close around his wrists. He thought for a strange and tilting moment about the angle of Nadia's arm and the way her shoulder had locked when his grip tightened. How he said, his voice was barely breath-shaped into a word. Webb looked at him. He said you could not tolerate a black woman sitting quietly in a hallway she had every right to be in. So you grabbed her arm, and you walked her into the one room where the people with the authority and the evidence to end your career were already assembled and waiting. He stepped aside so the agents could move Mercer toward the door. She was already holding everything Webb said. You just handed her the audience. The federal arraignment was held in a courthouse 2 miles north of the Hargrove building, in a courtroom that was smaller and less grand, but no less deliberate in its architecture. Mercer came in shackled. The shackles were standard procedure for a new federal detainee being presented for arraignment, and they were applied without particular attention to who was wearing them. He sat at the defendant's table in the clothes he had been wearing when the FBI agents had taken him from Philip Cotter's law office, the suit that had seemed appropriate for a defense strategy meeting, the tie that he had straightened twice before Webb walked through the door. Those details now had a quality of pathos that no one in the room was specifically noting, but that everyone in the room was registering. The prosecutor, Evelyn Carmichael, stood and delivered her argument for remand in a voice that was professional and economical and thorough. She explained the nature of the charges. She explained the financial complexity of the scheme and the corresponding sophistication of Mercer's role within it. She explained his 17 years of access to the courthouse document archive and the specific operational knowledge that access implied. She noted that the investigation was ongoing and that the integrity of that investigation required that the defendant not have contact with potential witnesses, documentary evidence, or systems to which he had previously had professional access. She said that the combination of these factors made him both a flight risk and an active obstruction risk. The magistrate had listened to all of it. She had also listened to Cotter's argument for conditional release, and then she had looked at Mercer briefly, and with the expression of a person performing a professional assessment, and she had ordered him remanded without bail. The shackles stayed on for the transport. Mercer was denied bail at the federal arraignment. The prosecutor, a woman named Evelyn Carmichael, argued that a former security officer with 17 years of access to courthouse records with demonstrated ties to an active racketeering operation and with a documented pattern of using his authority to obstruct and intimidate posed both a flight risk and an ongoing obstruction risk. The magistrate agreed. Mercer was remanded to the Metropolitan Detention Center. Because of his history in law enforcement, he was placed in protective custody. 23 hours a day in a 6x9 cell. 1 hour of outdoor time under supervision. No contact with general population. In the federal penitentiary, where Dale Mercer served his sentence, the days had a rhythm that was designed specifically to remove all variation. Wake at the same time. Eat at the same time. Return to the cell at the same time. Lights at the same time. In protective custody, the variation was even less. 23 hours in a 6x9 cell. 1 hour outside in a small concrete yard alone. No conversation beyond what passed through a slot in a steel door. He had been a man who needed to be seen. Who needed the wide marble corridors of the third floor. Who needed the click of his heels on stone, and the faces turning toward him, and the authority that radiated from the uniform and the keycard, and the 17 years of uninterrupted presence. He had none of that now. He had a thin mattress and a narrow frosted window and a routine that acknowledged his existence only in the most bureaucratic and impersonal terms. He thought in those hours about the bench outside courtroom 7, about the accordion folder, about the badge that had been clipped to her jacket the entire time beneath a lapel that had shifted in the morning chill. He thought about how close he had been to simply walking past. How easy it would have been. How nothing in his training, nothing in his 17 years on this floor had required him to stop and interrogate a woman who was sitting quietly on a bench doing her work. Nothing had required it. He had required it. He had required it of himself because of what he saw when he looked at her. And what he saw when he looked at her had nothing to do with who she was. It had everything to do with who he had decided long before that morning that someone like her could be. The mathematics of his mistake were as Nadia might have put it exact. He had made one wrong assumption, and the wrong assumption had destroyed everything. The Aldridge-Vanthorpe verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. The jury had been deliberating since Tuesday morning, and there had been a point on Wednesday evening when the attorneys on both sides had begun to manage their expectations in careful and private ways. But on Thursday, at 2:17, the foreperson sent a note to the bailiff. The note said they had reached a verdict on all counts. The courtroom filled in 40 minutes. Every seat. Gallery, press row, the bench behind the bar. Standing room in the back. Nadia was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was in the AG's conference room 4 blocks away, working on the financial analysis of the asset forfeiture proceedings, the process by which the company's seized holdings would be identified, valued, and applied to the restitution award. She was told by phone. Webb's voice was steady and matter-of-fact the way it was when he had done the thing he set out to do. Guilty on all primary counts, he said. 11 total. Aldridge and 3 senior executives. The company is ordered dissolved. Restitution of $14.3 million to the city. She said, good. She said, I will finish the asset analysis by end of week. She hung up and went back to the spreadsheet. Marcus Webb, standing on the courthouse steps in the October afternoon, had been asked by reporters what the verdict meant for the city. He had said that it meant that public money belonged to the public. He had said that it meant that people who built things people depended on had a legal and moral obligation to build them correctly. He had said that justice, when it finally arrives, comes with receipts. Then he had thanked the investigators and the clerks and the expert witnesses whose work had made the case, and he had walked back inside. The routine of the special housing unit at the federal facility where Mercer was placed was not designed for the comfort of its inhabitants. It was designed for containment. For Mercer, specifically protective custody meant that the normal, limited social contact of federal incarceration was reduced further. The echoing common rooms where inmates played cards or watched television were not available to him. The small freedoms of a general population housing assignment, the ability to sit in a yard with other people to participate in the administrative rhythms of a shared space, were not his. He was alone for 23 hours out of every 24. The 1 hour of outdoor time was in a small concrete enclosure where the sky was visible as a rectangle above him and nothing else. He had been for 17 years a man defined by his visibility, by being seen on the third floor, by being known, by the authority that radiated from his presence in a corridor that he understood as his. In the special housing unit, he was visible only to the guard who slid a tray through the slot at meal times and the administrator who counted him during the twice-daily head count. To everyone else, he was a number in a case file. He was inmate number 84729. He was a name on a roster. He was a person-shaped problem that the institution had placed behind a steel door and managed from the outside. He had made people feel exactly this way for 17 years. He had not known it while he was doing it. He knew it now. The national press, which had been circling the story since the morning of the courthouse incident, received the racketeering charges with the particular energy of journalists who recognize a story with genuine structural depth. It was not just a security officer who had grabbed the wrong woman. It was a security officer who had grabbed the wrong woman because the very prejudice that had made him useful to a corrupt company for 26 months was the same prejudice that had completely overridden his professional judgment on that Tuesday morning and led him to publicly expose himself to the people investigating his crimes. He looked like he didn't belong in law enforcement, one editorial read. It is a pity it took someone grabbing her arm for anyone to notice. The trial of the state of Virginia versus Aldridge Vanthorpe Construction Group concluded before Mercer's federal case came to trial. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned guilty verdicts on 11 counts against the company's chief executive, Edmund Aldridge, including contract fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the government. 3 senior executives received convictions on related charges. The company was ordered dissolved. The city of Richmond was awarded restitution of $14.3 million, recovered from seized assets and the company's dissolving accounts. Marcus Webb stood on the courthouse steps after the verdict and told the assembled press that justice, when it finally arrives, comes with receipts. 6 months after that, Dale Mercer's federal trial began. He sat at the defense table in a suit that was slightly too large for him. He had lost significant weight during his months at the detention center. His skin carried the specific pallor that develops from months under fluorescent light without real sunlight. His posture, once the posture of a man who owned every corridor he walked through, was now the posture of someone who had learned through incarceration how to take up as little space as possible. The courtroom gallery held journalists, legal observers, city officials, and 8 of the 11 people who had filed complaints against Dale Mercer over 6 years and been turned away by the union arbitration process. They sat and watched. Mitchell Crane testified for the prosecution under his immunity agreement. He was precise and unemotional, the manner of a man who has made his calculation and is executing it efficiently. He explained how Aldridge Vanthorpe had recruited courthouse contacts. He explained the Site Facilitation Fund. He explained Mercer's specific function, which was to identify and misfile any municipal structural inspection document related to Aldridge Vanthorpe's 3 city contracts before those documents could reach the discovery process. He testified that Mercer had been chosen specifically because his established history of largely unreviewed misconduct suggested he was manageable. He did not look at Mercer while he spoke. To men who thought the way Crane thought an instrument that had served its purpose did not require acknowledgement. Then Nadia Cole took the stand. She wore a tailored navy suit. Her hair was down. She carried no folder. Everything she needed had been in her head for 18 months. The prosecutor asked her to describe the morning of the courthouse incident. Nadia described it with complete clarity and no embellishment. She described arriving at the courthouse after a night of server work. She described finding the bench. She described Mercer's approach the way he had come around the corner and looked at her and made a decision before he took a step. She described what he said and what she said and what he did when she would not comply with an unlawful order. She described the pain in her shoulder when he twisted her arm. She described the corridor witnesses. She described what she had seen in his face. Then the prosecutor asked the question the room had been waiting for. Ms. Cole, at the time of the confrontation in the corridor, did you have any knowledge that Officer Mercer was receiving payments from the Aldridge Vanthorpe Construction Group? No, Nadia said. I had no knowledge of his involvement. I was there to testify about the financial records I had spent 18 months reconstructing. My attention was on the case and on the trial. And what was the result, the prosecutor asked, of what he did in that corridor? Nadia looked at the jury. She said, he looked at me and made a decision in under 3 seconds. He decided that a black woman in work clothes did not belong on a floor where she had a legal obligation to be. He made that decision before he asked a single question. And then he physically brought me into the one room in this building where every person present had the authority and the preparation to prosecute the corruption he had been paid to conceal. She paused. If he had looked at the manifest, she said he would have walked away. If he had checked the badge he never looked at, he would have walked away. If his certainty about who belongs where had not been stronger than his professional obligations, his name would have remained buried in a spreadsheet of 200 recipients, and we might never have connected his financial records to this case at all. But it was, she said, and so it did not. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. The foreman read the verdicts in a steady voice. Guilty on the charge of third-degree assault under color of authority. Guilty on the charge of false imprisonment. Guilty on the charge of official oppression. Guilty on the charge of federal bribery. Guilty on the charge of obstruction of justice. Guilty on all counts under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. When the final verdict was read, Mercer did not move for a long moment. His hands were folded on the defense table. Then the federal marshals came. He stood. He let them cuff him. He turned toward the gallery one last time. He found Nadia. She was watching him, not with triumph, not with anger, with the steady assessing attention of someone who records what they observe and draws only the conclusions the evidence supports. He looked away. The marshals walked him out. The doors closed. Federal Judge Raymond Archer delivered the sentence 3 weeks later. He said you were entrusted with access to the halls of justice in this city. The trust was not ceremonial. It was the foundation of your authority and the only legitimate basis for everything you did in that building. You used that access not to protect the institution, but to sell it. You made ordinary citizens doubt their right to be in a public building year after year with no meaningful consequence. And when you finally reached for the wrong person on the wrong morning, you did not even know it. That he said is the most damning thing about this case, not the corruption, the obliviousness. The sentence was 32 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 22. The city of Richmond was awarded full restitution from Mercer's seized assets. All of them, including the payments, every dollar. There is a particular quality to the moment when someone who has done wrong for a long time and been protected from the consequences of that wrong finally encounters those consequences in full. It is not always what the people who watch them do wrong expected it to feel like. It does not always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like exhaustion, like the release of a tension that has been held for so long that the release itself is disorienting. The 8 people who had filed complaints against Dale Mercer over 6 years and been turned away by the union arbitration process and gone home to their families and their routines carrying the particular frustration of having done the right thing and been told that the right thing was not sufficient. They were in the gallery for the federal verdict. They watched the foreman read the counts. They watched the marshals move in. They watched Mercer look back at the gallery one last time. Some of them looked back at him. Some of them looked at the floor. Some of them looked at Nadia afterward. In the corridor outside the courtroom, a woman named Diane Watkins, who had filed the first of those 9 complaints 6 years ago, after being removed from the third-floor corridor for reasons Mercer had documented as suspicious behavior, and she had documented as walking to the clerk's office with a certified letter found Nadia near the elevator bank. She did not have a prepared speech. She had not rehearsed anything. She just said, "You did not know about us when you sat down on that bench." And Nadia said, "No, I did not know about you." Diane said, "But you sat down anyway." Nadia said, "I had work to do." Diane nodded. She said, "That is the whole of it, is not it." She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. Nadia stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she walked back toward the courtroom. She had work to do. 3 months after sentencing, Marcus Webb called Nadia on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in her office reviewing a set of municipal bond records for a new case in Northern Virginia that had nothing to do with any of this. She answered on the second ring. Webb said, "I have news about the Mercer asset disposition." She set down her pen. He said, "The federal judge accepted my petition regarding the specific bribery proceeds. The $83,200 paid to Mercer over 26 months to misfile those inspection reports. Every dollar." She waited. "Those funds," he said, "have been formally designated to endow the Hargrove County Public Integrity Fellowship, a fully funded 2-year scholarship for Black women entering the fields of forensic accounting, public finance auditing, or municipal oversight. Applications open next spring. The fellowship," he added after a pause that felt deliberate, "will be named the Nadia Cole Public Integrity Fellowship." She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "The judge agreed with me that there was a precision to it that the situation required." She was quiet. She was thinking about the 26 months of bi-weekly payments, about the 11 inspection reports buried in the wrong folders to buy a corrupt company the time it needed, about the schools and the water treatment plant and the transit hub and the thousands of people who passed through them every day without knowing how close those structures had come to failing, about a man who had been paid month after month to make sure the truth arrived too late. And now every dollar of that money would pay for a young woman to learn how to follow the math. She said, "That is the most precise thing I have heard in 2 years." Webb laughed. He said, "I thought you would appreciate the arithmetic." Richmond, at the end of all of it, was still a city that had things to fix. That was true before Nadia Cole sat down on a bench in the third-floor corridor. It was true after. The difference was that one specific strand of the corruption that had been quietly undermining the things the city needed to function had been pulled loose and pulled on and followed all the way to its origin. And the people responsible for it were no longer in positions to protect themselves with the structures they had exploited. That was not everything. It was not a complete resolution to every form of injustice that moved through the corridors of public institutions. It was one case, one woman, one bench, one man who made one catastrophic assumption about who she was. But one case completely and thoroughly pursued is not nothing. It is, in fact, the whole of what justice is made of. Case by case, number by number, truth by truth. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, 14 months after the day, Dale Mercer pushed open the oak doors of Courtroom 7. Nadia Cole walked into the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse through the main lobby entrance. She wore a charcoal blazer and the same steel-toed boots, cleaned now but not replaced. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. She walked the corridor toward Courtroom 7. On the bench outside the courtroom, a young black woman sat with her head bent over a folder of papers she was annotating. She wore a graduate school sweatshirt. She was 23 or 24. A gold credentialing badge was clipped clearly and visibly to the front of her lanyard. She had been escorted to the third floor by the bailiff per the credentialing escort protocol that Marcus Webb had implemented as his first official act as Director of Public Integrity. Nadia slowed. She did not stop. The young woman looked up at the sound of footsteps. Their eyes met for a moment. Nadia nodded. The young woman nodded back. Nadia walked on. She passed the small bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance to the document annex. She did not stop to read it. She already knew what it said. Evidence does not disappear. It waits. The plaque beside the entrance to the document annex on the third floor of the Hargrove County Superior Courthouse had been placed there by the court staff without any formal authorization. It had been ordered and paid for by a collection of clerks, bailiffs, court reporters, and administrative assistants who had worked in the building for years and who had each in their own way understood what the events of that Tuesday morning had revealed about the place they worked in. Not about the building itself, about the people who moved through it, about the gap between what the building was meant to be a place where the truth was examined and justice was sought, and what certain people unchecked and unexamined over years had made of it. The plaque was small, bronze 4 inches by 3, mounted at eye level beside the door. It did not name anyone. It did not describe any event. It simply stated what had always been true about the work that happened in the room beyond the door, and what would remain true regardless of who tried to interfere with it. Evidence does not disappear. It waits. Nadia had been told about the plaque by the senior court clerk who had organized the collection. She had been told over the phone a call that lasted 6 minutes, during which the clerk had explained the idea and the process and then asked whether Nadia had any objection. Nadia had said no. She had said she was honored. She had said she thought it was exactly right. She had hung up and then sat for a moment at her desk, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. Just thinking about the things that last and the things that do not. She pushed open the doors to courtroom 7 and walked in. The bailiff looked up from his desk. "Good morning, Ms. Cole," he said. "Good morning," she said. She took a seat at the prosecution table. She opened her folder. She found the page she needed. She began to work. The bench outside was the same. The marble floors were the same. The frosted glass windows sent the morning light in through the same dim and serious angle. The only thing that had changed was who was no longer allowed to decide who belonged there. And on that Tuesday morning in early spring, in a courthouse that still stood because someone had refused to be moved from a bench where she had every legal right to sit, the work simply continued. If this story moved you, we hope you will subscribe to our channel, where we bring you the stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary injustice and chose not to look away. Justice does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in work boots, carrying a folder, and it simply refuses to move.